A perfect picture torn. I don't remember exactly when I first felt it. Maybe it was the way Sarah started coming home later than usual, her excuses wafer thin, but delivered with the same ease as a rehearsed performance. Maybe it was the subtle shift in how she looked at me, or didn't look at me. But it wasn't one moment that unraveled the picture-perfect life I thought we had. It was a series of small, almost imperceptible cracks in the foundation of what we'd built together. Sarah, my Sarah, the woman I'd promised forever to, standing before our friends and family, wearing white and a smile that I once believed, was only for me. She was the mother of my children, the woman who knew the best and worst of me. And yet, as I sifted through the evidence that confirmed my darkest suspicions, I realized that there was a part of her I had never known, a part that had betrayed me. The discovery, it started with a nagging sense of unease. I noticed her phone was always face down, her laughter a little too forced when she texted late at night. One evening, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the counter. My eyes flicked to the screen. I told myself not to look, that it wasn't right, that I trusted her. But my hand betrayed me before my mind could stop it. It was a message. Just a single line, but it might as well have been a dagger. Can't. Stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? I stared at the words until they blurred, the blood rushing to my ears, drowning out everything else. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and quiet observations. I became hyper-aware of her every movement, every word. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But the truth was there, hiding in plain sight, confronting the affair partner. When I finally pieced it all together, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. His name was Michael, a co-worker, someone she spent late nights with on work projects. I had met him once, briefly, at a company event. I remembered shaking his hand, his smile polite but dismissive, as if I was just another obstacle in his way. The confrontation wasn't planned. It wasn't something I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. It happened because I couldn't hold it in any longer. I waited for him outside his office one evening, leaning against my car as the cool night air bit at my skin. My chest felt tight, my pulse thrumming in my ears. When he finally appeared, I pushed off the car and stepped into his path. Michael. He stopped, his expression flickering between confusion and recognition. Do I know you? You do. My voice was low, steady, but every word carried the weight of my fury. I'm Sarah's husband. I watched as the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. I'm not here to fight you, I said, though my clenched fists betrayed my restraint. I just want to know, why? Why did you think it was okay to destroy my family? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen? My voice rose, the anger I had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. Didn't mean to sleep with a married woman. Didn't mean to betray someone who trusted. Her? He didn't answer. Couldn't. And in that moment, I realized there was nothing he could say that would make it better. Exposing the truth. The decision to confront Sarah wasn't an easy one. I wasn't sure how much of the truth I wanted to know, how long it had been going on, how deep it ran. But I couldn't live with the lies any longer. We sat in the living room, the kids asleep upstairs. She looked at me with curiosity, maybe even concern, as I paced the floor. What's going on? She asked, her voice gentle, as if I were a child on the verge of a tantrum. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. I know, Sarah. Her brow furrowed. Know what? Don't do that. My voice cracked, betraying the raw emotion that had been simmering beneath the surface. Don't play dumb. I know about Michael. I know everything. Her face fell, the color draining as her eyes widened in shock. Or was it guilt? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How long? I demanded, my voice rising. How long have you been lying to me? To our kids? Tears welled in her eyes, but they only fueled my anger. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. That's not an answer, I snapped, my hands trembling at my sides. How long, Sarah? She looked away, her shoulders slumping, as the weight of her actions seemed to crush her. 10 years, she said softly, barely audible. The words hit me like a freight train. 10 years. A decade of lies, of betrayal. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in around me. A shattered life. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. The beginning of the end. I can still recall the exact moment I found myself standing at the edge of my unraveling world, holding a truth so sharp it felt like it might cut me apart. It wasn't a single moment that brought me there. It was the slow erosion of trust, little whispers of doubt that became screams I could no longer ignore. Sarah was everything to me. The mother of our 2 children, my partner of 15 years, my compass in the storms of life. She had this laugh, a musical sort of sound that could light up even the darkest days. But lately, that laugh had felt distant, like it wasn't meant for me anymore. For weeks, maybe months, I had been living with a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the late nights or the sudden, almost imperceptible coldness between us. It was the way she avoided my eyes when I asked how her day had been, the way her phone seemed glued to her side, never out of her reach, always face down. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, insecure, but the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface no matter how deeply you try to bury it. The evidence. It was a Sunday evening when I found it. Sarah was upstairs putting the kids to bed, her laughter echoing faintly down the hall as she read them a story. I was in the living room, my hands idly scrolling through the Netflix menu, though my mind was elsewhere. Her phone, as always, was on the coffee table, face down. I don't know what compelled me to pick it up. Maybe it was the buzz of a notification. That seemed louder than usual, or maybe it was just the culmination of weeks of suspicion. My hand hovered over the device for a moment, a silent battle waging within me. I knew once I crossed this line, there was no going back. I unlocked it. Her passcode was the same as it had always been, a detail that struck me as both ironic and cruel. My fingers moved with a life of their own, navigating to her messages. And there it was, a thread of texts from a name I didn't recognize. Michael. The most recent message read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled up, my heart pounding louder with each passing second. The messages painted a picture that was impossible to deny. Flirtatious banter, plans to meet, explicit exchanges that left little to the imagination. My hands trembled as I set the phone back down, careful to leave it exactly as I had found it. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, my mind racing. The confrontation. That night, as Sarah climbed into bed beside me, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. The confrontation came 2 days later, when I could no longer keep it inside. We were in the kitchen, the kids outside playing. Sarah was chopping vegetables for dinner, humming softly to herself. "Sarah," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. She looked up, a small smile on her lips. "What's up?" "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her hands froze mid-motion, the knife hovering above the cutting board. "Okay." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Who is Michael?" Her expression shifted in an instant. The color drained from her face, her eyes widening in shock, or maybe guilt. She set the knife down carefully, her hands trembling. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Don't lie to me, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. I saw the messages, Sarah. I know. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. How long? I demanded, my voice cracking. How long has this been going on? Her shoulders shook as she let out a choked sob. A few months, she whispered. A few months, I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Why? Why would you do this? Was I not enough for you? It's not like that, she said, her voice barely audible. I never meant for it to happen. I swear I didn't. Then what is it like? I asked, my tone sharp. Explain it to me, Sarah, because I'm struggling to understand how the woman I gave everything to could do this to me. Meeting Michael days later, after sleepless nights and countless questions that went unanswered, I made a decision. I needed to confront him. The man who had inserted himself into my marriage, who had stolen what wasn't his to take. I found him at a cafe near his office. He looked exactly as I remembered. Polished, confident, the kind of man who probably thought the world owed him something. Michael, I said, approaching his table. He looked up, startled. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been guilt. Do you have a minute? I asked, my tone leaving no room for refusal. The shattered reflection, in the days that followed my confrontation with Michael, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. Each time I tried, all I saw staring back was a hollowed-out version of the man I thought I was. A man who had failed to protect the one thing that mattered most to him. Sarah and I existed in a tense silence, broken only by the mechanical rhythms of daily life. We still moved through the motions for the kids, packing lunches, attending school events, and reading bedtime stories. But behind closed doors, the weight of her betrayal sat between us like a stone. I found myself replaying the past 15 years of our marriage in my mind, searching for clues I had missed. The small moments when she had seemed distant, the excuses I had shrugged off, the times I had chosen to trust her when I should have questioned. Was this my fault? Was I too complacent? Too caught up in my own routines to notice that the woman I loved was slipping away from me? Late at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I would sit in the living room with a glass of whiskey, trying to drown the endless loop of thoughts that played in my head. But no matter how much I drank, the questions remained, sharp and unrelenting. The truth beneath the surface one evening, I finally broke. Sarah was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her as she worked on something for her job. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, the light from the screen casting a faint glow on her face. She looked tired, older. The same way I felt. Do you even regret it? I asked, my voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. She looked up at me, startled. What? You heard me? I said, stepping into the room. Do you regret what you did, or are you just sorry you got caught? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought she might not answer, but then she spoke, her voice trembling. I regret everything, she said. I regret hurting you. I regret putting our family in this position. I regret not coming to you sooner before it got to this point. Why didn't you? I demanded. Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy? Why didn't you give me the chance to fix it? I don't know, she said, shaking her head. I was scared. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong, and then Michael was just there. He made me feel seen, like I wasn't invisible. Invisible? I repeated, my voice rising. I loved you, Sarah. I love you. How could you ever think You were invisible to me? She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know. The struggle to move forward, we tried therapy. For the kids, if nothing else. Sitting in that sterile office with a therapist mediating our conversations felt like trying to rebuild a house from ashes. The sessions were painful, raw. Sarah talked about feeling neglected, about how the stress of parenting and careers had driven a wedge between us. I talked about my anger, my sense of betrayal, the loss of the life I thought we had. I don't know if I can forgive you, I told her during one session, my voice breaking. I want to, for the kids' sake, but I don't know if I can. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. And if you can't, I'll accept that. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you let me. The decision in the end, it came down to one simple question. Could I ever trust her again? Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, it doesn't just repair itself. It takes time, effort, and an unwavering commitment from both people. I stared at her one night as she sat across from me on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and for the first time in weeks I saw her. Not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. I'm not saying we can fix this, I said finally, my voice soft. But I'm willing to try. For the kids. For us. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. The road ahead rebuilding wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to walk away, when the weight of her betrayal felt too heavy to bear. But there were also moments of hope, small glimpses of the love we had once shared. We took things one day at a time. Slowly, cautiously, we began to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Some wounds never fully heal. They leave scars, reminders, of the pain we've endured. But those scars also tell a story of survival, of resilience, of the strength it takes to keep moving forward when everything inside you wants to give up. The weight of betrayal. It's strange how you can live with someone for years, share a life, a bed, and countless memories, and yet feel as though you're looking at a stranger. That's how I felt every time I glanced at Sarah after I found out. The moment I confronted her, time seemed to split. There was the life I thought we had, the laughter, the love, the moments I had cherished, and then there was the reality I was now forced to face. Every word she said, every look she gave me, felt tainted. I couldn't decide if I hated her, or if I hated myself more for still loving her despite everything. I found out by accident. Isn't that how these things usually go? It started with an innocuous notification on her phone, a name I didn't recognize. I wasn't proud of it, but I looked. A part of me hoped I was wrong, that I was jumping to conclusions. But the messages were there, clear as day. Michael. The name alone made my stomach churn, the confrontation. When I confronted her, I wasn't calm or composed like I'd imagined in my worst nightmares. I was shaking, my voice hoarse and raw. Who? Is he Sarah? I demanded, holding her phone out like it was a weapon. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, and she looked at me with those tear-filled eyes I used to think could never lie. I can explain, she stammered. Explain? I barked out a bitter laugh. Explain what? That you've been sneaking around, behind my back for God knows how long? That you've been lying to me? To our kids? She didn't answer, just sat there, trembling. I wanted her to fight, to yell, to do something, anything that would make sense of the chaos in my head. But her silence was worse than anything she could have said. How long, Sarah? I pressed, my voice breaking. How long has this been going on? Her lips quivered. 10 years, she whispered. It was like a punch to the gut. 10 years. A decade. Longer than our youngest child had been alive. The affair partner, I wasn't content with just confronting her. I needed to know who Michael was. I needed to put a face to the man who had so effortlessly dismantled the life I had worked so hard to build. It didn't take long to find him. Social media is a strange and terrifying tool when wielded by someone fueled by anger and heartbreak. Michael was everything I wasn't: polished, charming, the kind of man who seemed like he belonged in a magazine ad. He worked in marketing, had a smile that seemed practiced, and exuded confidence. I set up a meeting. We met at a coffee shop in the city, one of those trendy places with overpriced lattes and minimalist decor. He didn't know who I was at first. He just thought I was some guy wanting to talk business. When I told him my name, I saw the recognition hit him like a freight train. His smug smile faltered, and for a brief moment, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. "I'm Sarah's husband," I said, my voice low but steady. He swallowed hard. "Look, I cut him off, leaning forward. "Don't insult me by pretending you care about my feelings or my family. I just want to know one thing. Why? Why her? Why me?" He hesitated, glancing around the room as though searching for an escape. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said finally. "We just connected." "Connected?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's what you call destroying a family? A connection?" He didn't respond, and for a moment I considered walking away. But then I thought about my kids, about the life Sarah and I had built, and I realized I needed him to understand the weight of what he'd done. "You don't just hurt her, you know," I said, my voice trembling. "You hurt me. You hurt my kids. You've taken something from all of us that we can never get back." He looked down at his coffee, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Save your apologies," I said, standing up. "They don't mean anything to me." The aftermath confronting Michael didn't bring me peace. If anything, it only deepened the sense of betrayal. But it was a step, a small, painful step, toward understanding what had happened. Sarah and I are still living under the same roof, but it feels like we're worlds apart. Every day is a struggle, a battle between the part of me that wants to fight for our family and the part that wants to walk away. I've started journaling, trying to make sense of my emotions. Writing this down feels like shouting into a void, but it's better than keeping it bottled up inside. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll survive this or if I'll ever be able to forgive her. But for now, I'm taking it one day at a time. The weight of betrayal. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. I remember the morning light spilling through the curtains, the sound of the kids arguing over cereal, and Sarah bustling around the kitchen, humming a tune. It was so painfully ordinary that I can hardly believe how extraordinary the betrayal felt when I stumbled upon it. It wasn't suspicion that led me to her secret. It was sheer chance. A forgotten email left open on her laptop. The bold subject, line impossible to ignore. Last night was perfect. My stomach dropped. My heart thudded in my chest as if trying to break free. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it was nothing. But the pull of curiosity, of dread, was too strong to resist. I opened it. Unveiling the truth. The words in that email are seared into my memory. They weren't cryptic or subtle. They were brazen, passionate, and unmistakably intimate. "Michael," it began, "you make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I can't stop thinking about last night. About your touch, your smile, the way you looked at me like I was the only woman in the world." I stopped reading. My hands trembled, my breath quickened. My chest felt tight, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Michael. Who the hell was Michael? The kids' laughter from the other room suddenly felt like a cruel reminder of what was at stake. I wanted to scream, cry, punch something, but instead, I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the screen. Confrontation at midnight. That night, after the kids were asleep, I waited for her in the living room. My thoughts raced as I replayed every moment from the past 10 years. Every smile, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you." Had it all been a lie? When Sarah walked in, she froze. She must have seen the look on my face because her expression shifted from casual to cautious. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down her bag. I held up the printed email. The color drained from her face. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice low but heavy with anger. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her lips quivered, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered. "That's what you're worried about?" I shot back, my voice rising. "How I found out? Not the fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back?" She sank into the armchair, her head in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice trembling. I laughed bitterly. "Is that what you tell yourself? That it just happened? You've been lying to me, to our kids, to yourself. Tracking down Michael." I couldn't just let it rest. I needed to confront him. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed my family. It didn't take long to find him. A quick search through social media and a few emails Sarah had carelessly left on her phone gave me everything I needed to know. Michael was older than me, maybe in his late 40s, a polished man with silver-streaked hair, tailored suits, and a self-assured smile. He worked as an executive at some firm downtown. The next day, I called him. "This is Michael," he answered, his voice smooth and confident. "This is Sarah's husband," I said coldly. The line went silent. Face to face with the enemy. We met in a neutral spot, a park near his office. I wanted it to be public. I didn't trust myself alone with him. Michael arrived looking every bit the part of the suave executive. He wore an expensive watch, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He extended a hand when he saw me, but I ignored it. "I just want to talk," I said, my voice steely. He nodded, his confident demeanor faltering under my glare. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "A few years," he admitted, his tone cautious. "A few years?" I echoed, incredulous. "You've been sleeping with my wife for years and you say it like it's a casual affair?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't plan for this to happen. We just connected." "Connected," I repeated bitterly. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just destroy a marriage. You've ripped apart a family, my kids, my life. Do you even care about that?" He didn't answer, his silence infuriating me even more. "You're a coward," I spat, hiding behind excuses like, "We connected." You don't deserve her, and she sure as hell doesn't deserve me. I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides. "Stay away from my family. If I ever see you near Sarah or my kids again, you'll regret it." The fallout. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes red and puffy. "I talked to him," I said, my voice flat. Her face crumpled and she started to cry. "I'm sorry," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. "I don't want your apologies," I said, my voice breaking. "I want to know why. Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy?" Navigating the wreckage. The days that followed were suffocating. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a tomb. I moved through it like a ghost, avoiding Sarah as much as possible. When we did cross paths, the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. She tried to bridge the gap, Small gestures like leaving coffee for me in the morning, offering to take on chores I usually handled, but it all felt hollow. Every act of kindness seemed laced with guilt, a feeble attempt to repair what she had broken. But I wasn't ready. The nights were the worst. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every moment in agonizing detail. The way she used to smile at me when we first met. The late-night talks, the shared dreams, the promises we made. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. When did it all start to fall apart? Seeking answers in the silence. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat in the quiet of the living room. The house was still, but my mind was a storm. I needed clarity, answers, something to help me understand the why. I called my closest friend, Daniel. He'd been my rock for years, a steady, no-nonsense guy who always knew how to cut through the noise. "Hey, man," I said when he picked up, my voice heavy. "What's going on?" he asked, immediately sensing the weight in my tone. I told him everything. The email, the confrontation, the unbearable silence that had settled over my life since. He listened without interrupting, letting me pour it all out. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. What she did was wrong, no question about it. But if you want to move forward, you need to figure out what you want. Do you want to fight for this marriage, or are you ready to walk away?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like I don't even know her anymore." "Then maybe it's time to find out," he said. "Talk to her. Really talk to her. If nothing else, you deserve the truth." A difficult conversation. The next evening, I asked Sarah to sit with me after dinner. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the edge of her sweater, her eyes darting to mine and then away again. "I need to know," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I need to know why this happened." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not an answer," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She flinched but pressed on. "I was lonely," she said finally. "You were always busy." "With work, with the kids. And I know that's not an excuse, it's not. But I started feeling invisible. Like I was just here, existing. And then Michael came along and he noticed me. He made me feel seen." Her words stung, but there was a bitter truth in them that I couldn't ignore. I had been so focused on providing for our family, on being a good husband and father, that I hadn't stopped to consider what she might have been feeling. "I never stopped loving you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I felt like you didn't see me anymore." Her confession hit me like a punch, to the gut. I wanted to be angry, to hold on to my righteous indignation, but a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if I had failed her too. Rebuilding or letting go. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the tension in the house began to shift. We started talking more, not about the affair but about us, about where things had gone wrong, about what we both needed and wanted moving forward. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. But for the first time in years, we were being honest with each other. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to me. "Do you think we can ever fix this?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts hope and fear. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's worth trying." That was the first time I truly believed it might be possible to rebuild, not just for the kids, but for us. But trust, once broken, isn't easily mended. It would take time, effort, and a level of vulnerability that scared me. And even then, there were no guarantees. The first step. Forward, we started couples therapy, a few weeks later. It was awkward at first, sitting in a room with a stranger and laying bare the raw, painful truth of our marriage. But it forced us to confront things we'd both been avoiding for years. Through it all, I learned that healing wasn't a linear process. Some days I felt like we were making progress, like we might actually come out stronger on the other side. Other days, the pain of her betrayal felt as fresh as the day I found that email. But I also learned something about myself, that I had a capacity for forgiveness I never thought possible, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to give us a chance. The line in the sand. The day I confronted him was a day I'll never forget. His name was Michael, a name that now made my stomach churn. I had spent days piecing together the timeline, going through old messages and emails, trying to make sense of the betrayal. When I felt like I had enough, I made my decision. I needed to face him, to look him in the eye, and confront the man who thought he could steal pieces of my life without consequence. It wasn't revenge I was after. It wasn't even closure. It was accountability. The encounter, I found him at the cafe where Sarah had mentioned meeting friends countless times before. It was a quaint little place, all soft lighting and rustic charm. I remember the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint sweetness of baked goods. And there he was, Michael. He looked younger than me by a few years, dressed sharply in a tailored blazer and jeans. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as he scrolled through his phone. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to storm over and demand answers right then and there. But I didn't want to make a scene. Not yet. I walked up to his table and stood there waiting for him to look up. When he finally did, his face went pale. "You know who I am?" I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Yes," he replied, setting his phone down. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "Good. Then you know why I'm here." Words like weapons. We sat across from each other. A small wooden table, the only thing separating us. My hands were clenched into fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms as I fought to keep my composure. "You had an affair with my wife," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He nodded slowly. "I didn't mean for it to happen." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "That's the best you've got? You didn't mean for it to happen? You don't just accidentally fall into bed with someone else's wife?" Michael looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I cared about her." Cared about her? The words came out sharper than I intended. "She's married. We have kids. Did any of that matter to you?" He didn't answer, which only fueled my anger. "I want to know why," I demanded. "Why did you think it was okay to do this? To insert yourself into my life like this?" He hesitated, then said, "She told me she was unhappy, that she felt invisible." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. They mirrored what Sarah had told me. But hearing them from him was something else entirely. Drawing the line, I leaned forward, my voice low but filled with intensity. "You don't get to justify what you did by blaming my marriage. You made a choice, a selfish, destructive choice, and you don't get to play the victim here." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Good," I replied, "because you're not getting it." I stood up, my heart pounding. "Stay away from her. Stay away from my family. If I ever see you near them again, you'll regret it." I didn't wait for his response. I turned and walked out of the cafe, my hands shaking but my resolve unbroken. Aftermath. When I got home, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house, my sanctuary, my prison. I thought about the confrontation, about Michael's words, about the mess my life had become. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of control. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't erase the betrayal or the pain, but I could decide how to move forward. Inside the house, Sarah was waiting. When she saw me, she started to speak, but I held up a hand. "I talked to him," I said simply. Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said, "but I'm willing to try. For the kids. For us." It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. The weight of the storm walking out of that cafe, I felt the wind whip against my face, cold and sharp like the remnants of every word exchanged in that room. My hands were trembling, a mix of adrenaline and something else. Rage, sorrow, maybe both. The confrontation had given me clarity, but it also left a gaping emptiness. I didn't go straight home. I needed to think. Needed to let the storm inside me settle before stepping back into the house where everything had unraveled. I drove aimlessly, the city blurring past my window until I found myself parked in a quiet lot by the lake. The water stretched endlessly before me, dark and restless, reflecting the state of my own mind. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as memories of Sarah came rushing in. The echoes of betrayal. How had I missed the signs? I replayed every conversation, every glance, every moment over the past 10 years, searching for clues. I had been too blind, or perhaps too trusting, to see. There had been nights when she seemed distant, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Times when her phone had been glued to her hand, her laughter coming too easily at texts she claimed were from friends. I had chalked it up to stress, to the busyness of raising 3 kids, to the natural ebb and flow of a marriage. But now I knew better. She felt invisible. Michael's words echoed in my head, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. Had I really made her feel that way? Had I been so focused on providing for the family that I had failed to see her slipping away? I slammed, my fist against the dashboard, the dull pain grounding me in the present. This wasn't just about her or Michael. This was about me, about the man I had become and the man I wanted to be, for myself, for my kids. A decision to face the truth. The lake's stillness eventually began to calm me, the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore mirroring my slowing heartbeat. I couldn't avoid going home forever. There were questions that needed answers, truths that needed to be faced. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me like a silent witness to everything that had transpired. I sat there for a moment, taking a deep breath, before stepping out. The kids were asleep, their rooms dark and quiet. The sight of their peaceful faces as I peeked in on them filled me with a fierce protectiveness. No matter what happened between Sarah and me, they were my priority. Sarah was waiting for me in the living room, her posture tense, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "Did you talk to him?" she asked hesitantly. I nodded, my voice steady but devoid of warmth. "I did." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "What did he say?" "What does it matter?" I snapped, surprising even myself with the edge in my tone. "The only thing that matters is what you have to say. The confrontation at home." She flinched at my words, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't even know where to start," she whispered. "How about the beginning?" I said, sinking into the chair across from her. "How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" Her voice was barely audible. 10 years. 10 years. The weight of it crashed over me, stealing the air from my lungs. A decade of lies. A decade of betrayal. Why? The word came out more like a plea than a question. She looked up at me then, her eyes brimming with tears. "Because I was lonely, Alex. Because I felt like you didn't see me anymore. Like I was just part of the background." "That's not an excuse," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me. Not this." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. I was selfish. I was wrong, and I hate myself for it. The breaking point. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. I could see the regret etched on her face, hear it in her voice. But regret wasn't enough. I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted, my voice raw. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't try to defend herself. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, to make it right, to earn back your trust. Just, please don't give up on us. Her words hung in the air, a desperate plea for a second chance. The path to healing, her plea echoed in the silence between us, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Not yet. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I need time, I said, my voice low but firm. Time to think. Time to figure out what this even means for me, for us. Sarah nodded, her tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't argue, didn't push. Maybe she understood that words wouldn't fix this. I walked out of the room, the weight of her gaze on my back as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. The space felt different now, tainted somehow. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, the enormity of everything crashing over me again, looking inward. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Was I angry? Devastated? Both, and more. But beneath the anger there was something else, a gnawing sense of self-doubt. Had I been blind to her needs? Had I contributed to the cracks in our marriage? No. I couldn't let myself spiral into self-blame. She made a choice, a selfish, deliberate choice to betray me. And yet, why does part of me still care? The question haunted me as I drifted in and out of restless dreams, visions of our early days together flashing through my mind, the way she used to laugh at my dumb jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she looked at me. Was that all gone now? Or had it been gone for so long that I hadn't noticed? The next day morning came too quickly. The sound of our kids laughing downstairs brought me back to reality. They didn't know. They couldn't know. I forced myself out of bed, plastering on a neutral expression as I joined them at the breakfast table. Sarah was there too, her face pale and drawn. She glanced at me, but we didn't speak. Our oldest, Emily, noticed the tension. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked, her big brown eyes full of concern. I forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine, and I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Confronting the affair partner, I spent the rest of the day stewing, the unanswered questions eating away at me. I couldn't let it go. I needed more than Sarah's version of events. I needed closure. I found myself dialing Michael's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Alex, we need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. We met at a small park on the edge of town. Michael was already there when I arrived, pacing nervously near a bench. He looked different now, less confident, less smug. When I approached, he stopped pacing, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I figured you'd call," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Why did you do it?" I asked bluntly, my voice steady but cold. Michael hesitated, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, finally meeting my gaze. "We started as friends. She was lonely. I was lonely. It just happened." I laughed bitterly. "It just happened? For 10 years? I know it sounds bad. It is bad," I snapped, cutting him off. "You betrayed me. You betrayed your family. And for what? Sneaking around, lying to everyone who trusted you?" Michael's face crumpled. For the first time, I saw something resembling genuine remorse. "I screwed up," he said quietly. "I can't take it back, but I'm sorry, Alex. I'm sorry for everything." The turning point, hearing him apologize, should have made me feel better. But it didn't. If anything, it made the whole thing feel even more pointless. His apology wouldn't erase the betrayal, wouldn't fix the damage that had been done. I walked away without another word, leaving him standing there, confronting Sarah again. When I got home, Sarah was in the kitchen, folding a dish towel in her hands over and over again. She looked up as I walked in, her expression a mix of hope and fear. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Her question felt like a spark to dry timber. I dropped my keys onto the counter with a sharp clatter, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "How did it go?" I repeated, my voice edged with disbelief. "What did you think would happen, Sarah? That we'd hug it out like old friends?" Her face fell and she looked down at the towel in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. I hoped it would help somehow." "Help?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. The only thing it did was confirm what I already knew. You both made a choice, over and over again for 10 years. "Alex, please," she said, stepping toward me, her voice trembling. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I broke us. But I'm begging you, don't shut me out completely. Let you what?" I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "Explain it? Justify it? Tell me why you thought this was okay?" Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. She stood there, her shoulders slumping, and for the first time, I saw her not as my wife, but as a stranger, someone I didn't know at all. The pain of truth. "I trusted you," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less charged. "For 10 years, I built my life around you, around our family, and the whole time you were—" "What?" "Lying to my face." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Do you even know what that does to a person? To realize that everything they thought they knew, everything they believed in, was a lie? She covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob. "I was selfish," she whispered. "I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it." "Good," I said bluntly, the words cutting through the air like ice. "You should." The silence that followed was suffocating. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to soften. Not yet. Her confession. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know how it started. Michael was just there. He listened when I felt invisible. He made me feel wanted when I didn't feel like I mattered anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "And I didn't make you feel that way?" "It's not that simple," she said, her voice cracking. "You were always so busy, working, taking care of the kids, being everything. And I was too much of a coward to tell you how I felt, so I looked for it somewhere else." I stared at her, the weight of her confession sinking in. "Do you even realize how pathetic that sounds?" I said, my tone laced with disgust. "You had a problem, and instead of facing it, you ran straight into someone else's arms. For 10 years. She flinched, and for a moment I thought she might lash out, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded, her tears falling freely. "You're right," she said. "I don't have an excuse. I wish I could take it back." Across roads, her words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the life we'd built together. But another part, a deeper, angrier part, wanted to walk away and never look back. "Do you love him?" I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could. "Stop it!" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't. I never did. It was never about love, Alex. It was a mistake." A mistake. The word felt too small for the enormity of what she'd done, but as much as I hated it, I could see the truth in her eyes. The decision, I took a deep breath, my chest tight with emotion. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said honestly, and I don't know if I even want to. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter for support. I'll do whatever it takes, she said quietly. Whatever you need. Just don't give up on us. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there alone. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the photo on the nightstand, our wedding day, frozen in time. For the first time, I wondered if the man in that photo would recognize the one I'd become. A shifting path. The house felt emptier than it had ever been. I stood there for a moment, the silence in the air so thick I could almost hear the weight of my own thoughts. The photo still sat on the nightstand, its edges fraying like the life Sarah and I had once shared. I couldn't stop looking at it, the way we smiled at each other, completely unaware of the storm that would eventually tear us apart. I wanted to stay angry. I wanted to stay bitter, to punish her for what she'd done, to make her feel the same ache that had consumed me for weeks. But part of me was tired. Part of me didn't know if I had the strength to fight anymore. I ran my fingers through my hair, pacing in the dim light of our bedroom. What now? That was the question. What did I do next? It was clear that Sarah was broken. She was still my wife in name, but she wasn't the woman I had married, the woman I had loved. I didn't even recognize the version of her standing before me earlier. But could I let go of her? Could I throw away everything we had built? 3 kids, a decade of shared memories, struggles, triumphs. Could I just walk away from that? I sat on the edge of the bed, the cool sheets pressing against my skin, and let my mind drift back to that night. The confrontation with Michael still burned in my mind. The way his face twisted in guilt as I told him everything, as I laid out all the lies he'd woven into our lives. He was a coward, yes, but so was Sarah, in a different way. Sarah's plea. Sarah didn't sleep in the bed that night. She'd retreated to the guest room, and part of me was thankful for the space. I needed to think, to feel the weight of my own choices without the distraction of her presence. But even in the quiet of the night, I felt her absence like an open wound. I missed her voice, her laugh, the way she used to make me feel safe. But that safety was a lie. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, as expected, her hands still shaking as she brewed coffee. Her back was to me, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself as if bracing for impact. "Alex," she said, her voice soft and unsure. She turned to face me, eyes wide. "I know I'm asking for the impossible, but I need you to understand. I need you to know that I'm sorry, and I don't want to lose you. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." I stared at her, studying her face, the familiar lines of it now foreign, marked by regret and guilt. The woman who once made my heart race now seemed so small, so broken. "I don't know if I can do that," I said quietly, the words heavier than I expected. "You've done this before, Sarah. You've been here before, and I let it go." I paused, the ache in my chest rising. "And now? I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything will go back to the way it was." Her eyes filled with tears again, but I held my ground. "I can't pretend anymore," I whispered, the words tearing through me like jagged glass. A moment of clarity. We sat there in silence for a while. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock in the corner, a reminder that time was slipping by and neither of us could stop it. I stood up suddenly, my legs restless, and walked to the window. I could feel Sarah's eyes on my back, waiting for me to make a choice. I wasn't ready to make a decision, not yet. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I wasn't ready to sever the last tie that bound me to her either. Maybe I needed more time. Maybe this wasn't the end. But I knew I had to find a way to move forward, whether it was with her or without. "Do you love me, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely above. A whisper, though I knew she could hear the pain in it. She was silent for a long time before answering. "I do. I always have. And I'll never stop." I turned to face her then, the weight of her words sinking in. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. "I don't know if that's enough." "Anymore," I said, the words cutting through the air like a confession. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked so small, like a child seeking solace in a world that had left her behind. The decision. I left her standing in the kitchen, the scent of coffee filling the space between us like a barrier. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't closure. It was a beginning. I walked outside, the air crisp against my skin as I stood there, letting the morning light warm my face. I needed to decide what kind of man I was going to be from here on out. The next few weeks were a blur of uncertainty. I still couldn't look at Sarah without feeling like a stranger was standing in front of me. But I also couldn't deny the part of me that still loved her, the part that didn't want to watch everything crumble to dust. But trust, that was gone. And trust was everything. I spent the next few weeks questioning, weighing my options. There was no easy answer. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't continue to live in this limbo forever. A weight of silence days passed like slow-moving shadows, stretching longer than they ever should. I couldn't escape the constant churn inside me, the mixture of anger, sorrow, betrayal, and love. The house had become an echo of the life we used to have. Every room felt foreign, every corner marked by memories that had been tainted by the revelations. I couldn't even look at the photos of our children without feeling like I was carrying the weight of something so heavy it could crush me. How could she? That was the question that plagued me at every moment. How could Sarah betray me? Betray us? For someone else? What had gone wrong in our lives that had made her seek comfort in another man's arms, another man's words? I had loved her. I had given her everything. And still, she chose him. The answer, as it always did when I wasn't actively avoiding it, came rushing in like a flood. It wasn't just the affair. It was the years of distance that had quietly crept into our relationship, years of neglecting each other, not seeing the cracks beneath the surface until they were too wide to ignore. She was right in some ways. She was sorry. But apologies don't heal wounds. They don't stitch up the pieces of a broken heart. Trust, once shattered, is like glass. It can never be put back together. The confrontation with Michael, I had to see him. I had to look him in the eye and make him understand the destruction he had caused. It wasn't enough to simply know what he had done. I needed to hear it from him. I needed to understand why. I found him at a bar a few nights after the conversation, with Sarah, sitting alone at a corner booth. He hadn't seen me yet, and I stood at the entrance for a moment just watching him. He looked so normal. How could someone so ordinary cause so much damage? My hands balled into fists at my sides as I stepped forward. My feet moved with a purpose, and when I reached his table, I stood there for a beat longer than necessary, letting him feel the weight of my presence before I spoke. He looked up, his face dropping when he saw me. A quick, almost imperceptible twitch of his jaw told me everything. He recognized me. Guilt. It was in his eyes, in the way he couldn't quite hold my gaze. "You," I said, my voice low, barely, a whisper in the clamor of the bar around us. "You're the reason my family is falling apart." Michael's face went pale. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but paused, knowing there was no excuse he could offer that would make this right. His lips trembled slightly, and I could see the discomfort in his posture as he leaned back in his seat, trying to make himself smaller. "Are you sorry?" I asked, my voice sharp, demanding. Are you sorry for what you've done? For tearing apart a family for your own selfish needs? He looked at me with wide eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a man searching for the right words. But there were none. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did, he said weakly. It was the coward's defense, the weak apology that rang hollow. No, you made a choice, I shot back. You chose her over and over. You knew what you were doing and you didn't care. My hands gripped the back of the chair across from him. What about my kids? Did you think about them? He shifted uncomfortably. I never meant for it to go that far. Of course not, I sneered. That's the thing about betrayal, Michael. It never starts with big gestures. It starts with small lies, a glance here and there. And before you know it, you've destroyed everything. The call that never came. I walked away from Michael that night with a feeling I couldn't quite explain. An odd sense of emptiness. I didn't get the satisfaction I had expected, the closure I thought I'd feel by confronting him. I had stood face to face with the man who'd been a catalyst for so much of my pain, and yet all I felt was hollow. Sarah's apology still haunted me in those quiet moments when I thought of her, when I remembered the way she used to laugh, the way she used to look at me. I never asked for this. I never wanted this. I should have been able to forgive her. She was still my wife, still the woman I once loved with every fiber of my being. And yet, even as she begged for another chance, I couldn't bring myself to trust her again. Trust was gone. The foundation of everything we had built together had been cracked beyond repair. It wasn't just Michael I had to confront, it was her. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the one person who needed to answer for this the most was Sarah. But how could I confront her without tearing myself apart in the process? A lonely walk. I spent the following week in a haze, drifting from one moment to the next without fully engaging. Work was a blur. The kids were distant. And Sarah seemed like a shadow in the house. She would linger at the door when I came home, waiting for me to say something. The weight of a broken promise. I had been living in a daze, an unrelenting fog clouding my thoughts as I wandered through the motions of my everyday life. The space between me and Sarah had grown insurmountably wide, despite us still occupying the same house. She tried, apologizing in every possible way. But no matter what she said, no matter how much she pleaded with me, the betrayal was like a constant echo in the back of my mind, reverberating with every step I took. I had caught her. There was no question about it. The evidence, the lingering trace of a secret life she had been living without me was undeniable. The photos, the messages, the late nights that didn't make sense when I looked at the timeline. All of it came together like a puzzle, the pieces forming a picture I wasn't prepared for. And yet, it was right there, staring me in the face. How long had it been going on? How many times had she held his hand, kissed his lips, whispered words that should have been for me? The anger inside me was like a storm gathering force. The storm had been brewing for years, hidden behind her false smiles, behind the facade of our happy life. Now it had broken free. But the hardest part was not the confrontation itself, nor the way she tried to explain her actions. It was the fact that, at some point, I had let myself believe that we were solid, that I had trusted her, and she had shattered that trust. The confrontation with Sarah. It had been 2 days since I found the evidence. 2 days since the world I thought I knew came crumbling down, and in those 2 days, I didn't sleep, didn't eat. I just existed in that space of uncertainty, replaying everything over and over in my head. I should have known. I should have seen it coming. How could I not? The moment came one evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me. The kids had gone to bed. The house was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. I could feel her presence before she even entered the room. Sarah stood in the doorway, hesitating for a moment, before she took a few tentative steps toward me. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. "I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't have the words. How do you speak when your heart is so heavy, when your thoughts are consumed by the images of your wife in someone else's arms? How do you look at the person you thought you knew and not feel like a fool? I finally met her gaze, my voice low, almost dangerous. "How long, Sarah?" Her lips quivered as she shook her head. "What do you mean?" I slid the envelope across the table, watching her as her eyes flicked to it and then back to me. Panic flashing in her gaze. She knew what was inside. She had to know. "Don't play coy with me," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "I found everything, Sarah, the photos, the messages. Him." Her face paled, the color draining from her skin as she stared at the evidence in front of her. The silence hung thick between us, suffocating the room. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling, as if that could explain away the years of lies, the years of us living in this false reality. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I echoed, my voice rising. "A mistake?" I slammed my hand down on the table, the sound sharp and violent. "This wasn't a mistake, Sarah. A mistake is something you fix. A mistake is when you spill coffee on the carpet or forget to take out the trash. This is betrayal. This is a choice, a conscious decision." She flinched, tears welling in her eyes as she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I swear I never wanted to hurt you." "You hurt me." The words felt like acid in my mouth. "You took everything we had, everything we built, and you threw it away for what? For some cheap thrill? For someone else to give you what I couldn't?" The tears fell freely now, her face crumpling as she sat down at the table, the weight of my words crashing down on her. "I don't know why I did it. I was lonely. We were drifting apart, and She choked on her words. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake, and I don't expect you to forgive me." I stood up, my chair scraping violently against the floor, and paced toward the window. My hands were shaking, the anger and the hurt threatening to spill over. But I couldn't show her that. Couldn't let her see how much this was destroying me. I was the one who had been betrayed, and yet, there I was, trying to contain the explosion inside me. How could she? How could she throw away everything for him? The confrontation with Michael. After Sarah's apology, her hollow, meaningless apology, I needed to confront him, the man who had taken her from me, the man who had taken my place in her bed, in her life. I had to see him, had to know the man who could look me in the eyes and still do this,